My name is Brookston Lowell, and in my 70s, I suddenly found myself all alone. But loneliness had never frightened me much. I had spent most of my life observing the stars, first as a keen amateur, then as a student astronomer, and then as a professor of astronomy at the University of Colorado. Space has taught me many things, but most importantly, patience and the realization that even the closest objects in the universe are infinitely far apart. My home in Colorado Springs sits on a hill with a great view of the mountains. It's an old family mansion that I inherited from my parents. 4 bedrooms, a spacious living room with a fireplace, a study where I once worked on scientific papers, and of course, a small observatory on the roof, my personal escape capsule from reality. I set up a telescope there back in the 80s when Rebecca, my wife, was alive, and our son Elliot had just started school. Rebecca died 15 years ago of cancer. We had 32 years together, and every day I thank fate for meeting her. She was a high school literature teacher, and perhaps it was this strange combination, her love of words and my fascination with the stars, that made our marriage so harmonious. When the doctors told us the diagnosis, we both knew that time was short, but Rebecca remained herself until her last day, calm, wise, with a slight smile on her lips. After her death, the house was empty. Elliot had been living apart for a long time by then, occasionally visiting us on holidays. Our relationship with our son had always been difficult. He grew up withdrawn, with a kind of inner protest against everything I represented: an academic career, a measured life, a passion for science. Perhaps I was too immersed in my research and didn't pay enough attention to him. Or maybe he just saw me as a father who was too strict, demanding that I study as hard as I had once studied. Elliot took a completely different path. After college, from which he graduated with difficulty and only thanks to my persistence, he took a job at a travel agency. Nothing fancy, just selling trips and booking hotels. I was disappointed. With his abilities, he always had a sharp mind and an excellent memory. He could have achieved much more. But Elliot preferred the easy way out, and over time I came to terms with that. After all, it was his life, and he had the right to live it his way. After Rebecca died, Elliot visited me even less often. Sometimes we didn't see each other for months, exchanging only brief phone calls on Sundays. I didn't blame him. After all, what could a young man be interested in talking to an elderly professor father? I immersed myself in my work until age forced me to retire, and then all that was left were books, a telescope, and memories. 3 years ago, Savannah Holbrook came into Elliot's life. He met her at his agency. She came to book a tour to Mexico. Savannah was 8 years younger than Elliot, making her, by my calculations, 32 years old at the time they met. An attractive brown-haired girl with slightly slanted green eyes and a permanent half-smile that I later realized never reached those very eyes. Elliot had brought her to my house for dinner a month after they'd met. Savannah made a pleasant impression, polite, attentive, with what seemed to me at the time to be a genuine interest in my work and hobbies. She asked questions about stars, listened to my stories about galaxies and black holes, admired the house and especially the observatory. "You're a real scientist, Mr. Lowell," she said then, standing by the telescope. "Elliot told me so little about you, and you are such an interesting man." I confess I was flattered by her words. After so many years of loneliness, it was nice to feel an interest in myself, especially from an attractive young woman. I did not immediately notice the slight reproach to Elliot hidden in her compliment. 6 months later, they announced their engagement, and 3 months later, they had a modest wedding with only a couple dozen guests. It was at the wedding that I first met Audrey Holbrook, Savannah's mother, a tall, thin woman with the same slanted gaze as her daughter, but only brown eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating something. Audrey was about 55, worked as an accountant for a small company, and, as I learned later, had recently divorced her second husband. "It's so nice to meet you, Professor," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Savannah has told me so much about you. Such a successful man, and such a big house, for one." The last phrase sounded strange, but I put it down to the awkwardness of the first meeting. We exchanged a few more meaningless phrases, and then Audrey turned her attention to the other guests. However, I caught her appraising gaze several times during the evening. After the wedding, they rented a small apartment near the city center. Elliot continued to work at a travel agency, and Savannah took a job as a receptionist at a spa. I visited them a couple times, but I didn't feel comfortable in their cramped apartment. Savannah always greeted me with a smile, but there was a kind of regret in her eyes as if she expected more from her husband's father. About 6 months after the wedding, Elliot called me with an unexpected proposal. Dad, Savannah and I have been thinking, you have such a big house, and you're all alone. Maybe we could move in with you. You wouldn't be so lonely, and we could help out around the house. I admit I was taken by surprise by the suggestion. On the one hand, the thought of the house being full of life again was tempting. On the other hand, I was so used to my solitude, to being able to go up to the observatory at any time, or to sit in my study with a book for hours without distraction. I don't know, Elliot. You'll be crowded with a young family. No, Dad, that's a great idea. He sounded strangely enthusiastic. The house is huge, there's plenty of room for everyone. Besides, we can save for our own place. I finally agreed. Perhaps it was my chance to establish a relationship with my son, to get to know him better, to get closer. Plus, the thought of having breakfast and conversation instead of an empty kitchen, waiting for me in the mornings, seemed appealing. Elliot and Savannah moved in 2 weeks later, taking the guest bedroom on the second floor. The first few days were filled with hustle and bustle, unpacking, settling in. Savannah really took over most of the household chores, cooking, cleaning, even planting a small flower bed in front of the house. Elliot seemed happy, socializing more with me, sometimes even keeping me company at the observatory, though without much enthusiasm. But about a month later, something happened that should have alerted me. At dinner, Savannah said casually, "Brookston, I talked to my mom today. She's having trouble renting her apartment. The landlord almost doubled the price. She can't afford it on her salary." I looked at her questioningly, not quite sure what she was getting at. I thought, Savannah continued, glancing at Elliot, who was suddenly very busy with his dinner. "We still have 2 spare bedrooms. Maybe Mom could stay here for a while, until she finds something suitable." I remembered Audrey Holbrook, her appraising look at the wedding, and her odd comment about my house. Something inside me resisted the idea, but there was no direct reason to say no. "Temporarily, I suppose," I clarified. "Of course, Dad," Elliot interjected. "Just for a couple months, no more." I agreed, though with some hesitation. 3 days later, Audrey Holbrook moved into my house, taking the bedroom next to the newlyweds' room. And from that moment, the atmosphere in the house began to change subtly. Audrey, unlike Savannah, didn't bother with housework. She spent most of her time in front of the TV in the living room or talking on the phone. She often intervened in conversations between Elliot and me, diverting them in unexpected directions, and I found myself increasingly aware that my son seemed to avoid being alone with me. I soon noticed that Savannah and Audrey were often whispering, silent when I entered the room. Sometimes they'd seclude themselves with Elliot in the kitchen, and from there they'd have muffled but emotional conversations. When I asked if everything was okay, Savannah would smile her invariable half-smile. "Sure, Brookston. Just discussing family matters." Family matters, as if I wasn't already a part of this family. One day, about 2 months after Audrey moved in, I overheard a conversation between her and Savannah as I walked past the kitchen. "We have to be careful," Audrey said in a muffled voice. "The old man's no fool. He might get suspicious." "Mom, everything's going according to plan," Savannah said. "Elliot is totally on our side. It won't be long before we'll be able to—" They stopped talking when they saw me in the doorway. Savannah immediately smiled and offered me tea. I declined and retreated to my office, feeling a chill run down my spine. The old man, the plan, totally on our side. These phrases swirled around in my head, forming an unpleasant picture. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, wondering what was going on in my house. I remembered how Savannah had recently inquired about my savings and retirement, ostensibly out of concern for my well-being. How Audrey had inquired about the will, if I had any desire to get things in order. Elliot's sudden insistence that I sell the stock I'd been holding for years before it depreciated in value. Gradually, I began to realize that my house had become a battlefield where I was outnumbered. 3 pairs of eyes watched my every move, three heads pondering how best to utilize the old astronomy professor and his possessions. The couple of months promised for Audrey's stay had long since expired, but no one had even mentioned her departure. On the contrary, she settled into my house as comfortably as if she had always lived here. Elliot had grown more and more distant, often coming home late and avoiding conversation. And Savannah? Savannah continued to smile her usual half-smile, but I could see the impatience in her eyes more and more, like she was waiting for something. Another 6 months went by like that. My house, which had once been my refuge, became strange and uncomfortable. More and more often, I went up to the observatory, where I could be alone with myself and the stars, without the appraising glances and muffled conversations behind me. And then one evening, looking through the telescope at the distant constellations, I made a decision. Something had to change before the situation got completely out of hand. And I had an idea, perhaps naive, but it seemed right at the time. A family trip to Europe that would bring my son and me closer together and remind him of the times Rebecca and I had taken him on trips. Perhaps away from home, away from familiar surroundings, he would remember that I was still his father and not just an old man with possessions. Full of determination, I went down to the house, not realizing that this idea would lead to events that would change our lives irreversibly. Mornings in my house now began not with silence and a cup of strong coffee alone, but with muffled conversations in the kitchen and the clinking of dishes. It seemed like a small thing to get used to, but more and more I found myself missing those times when I could sit by the window and watch the sunrise over the Colorado mountains, absorbed in my own thoughts. Now, on my way down to breakfast, I was always met with a silent tension that hung in the air as soon as I entered the kitchen. Savannah was fussing over the stove. Elliot was usually sitting on his phone, and Audrey always took my favorite spot by the window, as if intentionally showing me who was the lady of the house. "Good morning, Brookston," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "How did you sleep?" The question was tinged with false concern, as if I were being asked about the well-being of a seriously ill person. I always answered politely but briefly, trying not to give rise to further inquiries about my health, which invariably boiled down to the same thing. Whether it was time for me to get some rest and let the young people take more care of me. Fine, thank you," I replied, taking a seat at the table. Savannah placed a plate of oatmeal in front of me. "Good for your age," even though I had repeatedly said I preferred scrambled eggs. A small detail, but it perfectly illustrated what was happening in my house. My preferences, my desires, no longer mattered. One morning, about 8 months after Audrey moved in, I heard her talking to Savannah in the kitchen, unaware that I had already come downstairs and was standing in the hallway. "You're taking too long," Audrey said irritably. "How long can you wait? The old man could live another 10 years in this condition." "Mom, don't rush things," Savannah replied quietly. "I'm working on it. Elliot is almost ready to offer him a nursing home. We've already found a good place." "A nursing home," Audrey snorted. "Who's going to pay for that good place?" "No, we need control of his finances, and soon. Have you seen his latest bank statement? He's got more money than we thought." I froze, not believing my ears. They were going through my papers? Were they planning to put me in a nursing home? Me, who still went for 5-kilometer walks 3 times a week and could read the fine print without glasses. "What do you suggest?" Savannah asked with a note of irritation. "We need to tread carefully. If he suspects something wrong, he can rewrite the will." "Pressure," Audrey replied succinctly. "Everyone his age has blood pressure problems. A little adjustment to his medication, and he'll be more compliant, less able to make his own decisions." I got a chill inside. They weren't just planning to manipulate me. They were talking about damaging my health. I quietly stepped back and went up to my room, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I had skipped breakfast that day, citing a headache. I'd stopped taking any pills Savannah offered me ever since. It was like Elliot was turning into a different person all this time. My son, who'd never been particularly close to me, but still had some respect for me, now barely gave me a glance. His voice became irritated when addressing me, as if every question or request was an unbearable burden. One evening, I asked him to help me set up a new router for the internet, a task I could have handled myself, but I wanted to spend some time with my son. "Really, Dad?" he sighed, not taking his eyes off the TV. Can't you ask one of your professor friends? I don't have time for that. You have the whole evening free, Elliot, I pointed out gently, and I was thinking that we could. Exactly, he interrupted me sharply. It's a free night and I want to rest, not mess around with your equipment. Why are you always so selfish? His words hit me harder than I expected. Selfish? Me, who gave this house to his family, who silently tolerated the invasion of his life, who always tried to help him. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bother you, I answered quietly and left for my office. Half an hour later, Savannah peeked in, a look of feigned concern on her face. Brookston, Elliot said you two had a misunderstanding. You know, he's very tired at work. Maybe you should be a little understanding. At your age, you don't have much to worry about, and he's still young and building a career. Building a career. Elliot had been working at the same travel agency for 7 years without any promotion. But I remained silent, nodding in response. There was no point in arguing. I had already realized that in this game, I was 1 against 3. The manipulation became more and more blatant. Audrey started casually mentioning stories in front of me about elderly people whose children were forced to take over their finances because of senile indiscretion. Savannah increasingly commented that I looked tired or distracted, especially in front of guests. And Elliot seemed to fully believe in the image they had created of an infirm old man in need of supervision. It was especially hard to watch them manipulate my son. After one of their family conversations behind closed doors, Elliot came out with a determined look on his face and headed straight for my office. Dad, we need to talk about your finances, he announced without preamble. I think you should add me as a co-borrower on your accounts. It'll be safer. Safer for who, Elliot? I asked, putting the book down. For you, of course. He seemed genuinely surprised by my question. You're getting, well, forgetful. Yesterday you couldn't find your glasses, even though you had them on your forehead. One glasses incident, and I'm no longer capable of managing my finances? I looked at my son more closely and saw in his eyes what scared me the most. He really believed what he was saying. Savannah and Audrey had done a great job convincing him that I needed their control. I'll think about it, I answered evasively, not wanting to provoke conflict. Elliot shook his head unhappily and left the office, muttering something about stubborn old men. I remained seated, wondering how my own son could have turned into a man I barely recognized. I thought of Rebecca often in those days. What would she have said when she saw what our family had become? How would she have handled the situation? Rebecca has always been wiser than me about human relationships. People rarely change completely, Brooke, she used to say. They just become more candid versions of themselves. Does that mean my son has always been like this? Greedy, easily manipulated, willing to betray his own father for money? Or had Savannah and Audrey turned him into that person? I didn't know the answer, but I felt like I was losing him more and more every day. One evening, about a year after Audrey had moved in, I went up to my observatory, feeling a particularly strong need for solitude. It had been a rough day. Savannah had accidentally thrown out several of my science journals, calling them old junk, and Elliot had openly suggested for the first time that I consider a more suitable place to live. Even my office was no longer a safe haven. I caught Audrey there several times, ostensibly checking to see if it needed dusting. Looking at the stars through the telescope, I suddenly realized that I felt like a stranger in my own home. Gradually, step by step, they were pushing me out of my space, out of my life, and worst of all, they were doing it at the hands of my son. But what could I do about it? Kick them out? Elliot was my only child, my flesh and blood. Despite everything that was happening, a part of me still hoped to reach out to him, to bring back that boy who had once gazed at the stars through that telescope with rapt attention. That night, watching the distant galaxies, I remembered how Rebecca, little Elliot, and I had traveled through Europe many years ago. Elliot was 12 at the time, and it was our first big family trip. We visited observatories in several countries. I was preparing material for a research paper, but we also found time for the usual tourist activities. Elliot was fascinated by the Colosseum in Rome, the canals of Venice, and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It was a happy time when we were truly a family. And then it hit me. Maybe traveling is exactly what we need right now. To get out of the ordinary, to be in new places that would evoke fond memories. Maybe away from home, away from Savannah and Audrey's influence, I could reconnect with my son. The idea seemed naive, but I grasped at it like a drowning man grasping at straws. The next morning at breakfast, I suggested, I think we could all use a vacation. How would you feel about going to Europe? Elliot, do you remember going there with your mom when you were a kid? There was a pause. Elliot pulled away from his phone and looked at me in surprise. Savannah and Audrey exchanged quick glances. Europe? Cheery, Savannah asked, and I could hear a note of interest in her voice. That sounds interesting, didn't it, honey? Elliot shrugged, but I could see something in his eyes that looked like a memory of those happy days. Well, that was a long time ago, he said uncertainly. But yeah, it wasn't a bad trip. I could organize everything, I continued enthusiastically. 2 weeks in Europe, the same countries as last time. Italy, France, maybe add Spain. What do you say? And who will pay for this trip? Audrey asked, pretending that she was just clarifying the details. Me, of course, I answered. Consider it my gift to the family. Savannah and Audrey's faces lit up, and I realized I'd hit the mark. A free trip to Europe was something they wouldn't turn down. Even Elliot seemed interested. That's very generous of you, Dad, he said, and for a moment I thought I saw a glimmer of the old Elliot in his eyes. When are you planning this trip? I was thinking about next month, I answered. It's nice weather, not too hot, but not too cold. Great. Savannah clapped her hands together. I've always wanted to see Paris, right, Mom? Audrey nodded, but I noticed that she was looking at me with suspicion. Perhaps she thought my sudden desire to spend a substantial sum on a family trip was strange, but she quickly hid that expression behind a smile. That's very nice of you, Brookston. A family vacation is just what we all need. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house improved a little. Elliot stopped by my office more often, inquiring about the details of the upcoming trip. Savannah was unusually friendly, even starting to make scrambled eggs for breakfast instead of oatmeal. Only Audrey remained wary, often watching me with a calculating expression. I plunged into organizing the trip with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in a long time. I contacted a travel agency, not the one where Elliot worked. I didn't want my colleagues to know the details of our trip. Selected hotels and booked excursions. I paid special attention to the places that had made the greatest impression on Elliot as a child. The Colosseum, the Eiffel Tower, the canals of Venice. One evening as I was working on the itinerary in my office, Elliot stopped by. He looked a little embarrassed, which was unusual for him lately. Dad, do you really remember how much I liked the Colosseum? He asked, looking at the brochure on my desk. Of course I do, I smiled. You loved it. Made your mom and I go back the next day because you wanted to hear the story of the gladiators again. Elliot smiled weakly, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow of the boy I remembered in his eyes. I'd almost forgotten about it, he said quietly. How old was I then? 12? Yes, I nodded. You'd just started 7th grade. Mom insisted on this trip, even though I was up to my eyeballs in work. She always knew how to prioritize. We were silent for a moment, both of us immersed in our memories. Then Elliot coughed awkwardly. Well, I'll be off. Good luck with your planning. Thanks, son, I replied, feeling my heart clench with hope. Maybe not all was lost. Maybe this trip would actually help us rebuild what had been destroyed. The following weeks passed in preparations. I booked tickets, booked hotels, mapped out a detailed itinerary. Elliot was occasionally interested in the details, but mostly kept to himself. Savannah was much more enthusiastic, constantly asking about the stores and restaurants we'd be visiting. Audrey, on the other hand, just watched, only occasionally inserting comments about how expensive this trip must be. A week before we left, I gathered everyone in the living room to go over the final details. I spread out maps, brochures, and printouts of reservations on the table. Savannah and Audrey sat side by side on the couch. Elliot sat in a chair, and I stood at the table, feeling like a professor giving a lecture. So we leave next Thursday, I began, pointing to the printed tickets. First Rome for 4 days, then Venice for 3, then Paris for 5, and we finished with Barcelona, also 3 days. I booked good hotels in the center of each city so we could easily get to the main attractions. I talked about the excursions, restaurants, museums I planned to visit, about how important it would be to see the sunset from Montmartre in Paris and take a gondola ride in Venice, about how we would enjoy European food and culture as a family. As I talked, I noticed Savannah and Audrey exchanged a few glances that looked like they were satisfied. Elliot, on the other hand, seemed distracted, frequently glancing at his phone. "This all sounds wonderful, Brookston," Savannah said when I was done. "You've done such a great job. We're all looking forward to this trip, aren't we, Elliot?" My son looked up from the phone and nodded, but without much enthusiasm. And in that moment, I felt a prick of doubt. Would this trip really make a difference? Or was I just getting my hopes up? But it was too late to back out. The tickets were bought, the hotels booked, the itinerary mapped out. All I had to do was hope that 2 weeks away from my familiar surroundings would help Elliot and I find a common ground, restore at least some of what we'd had before. The night before I left, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I lay in my room, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the creaking floorboards, the wind outside the window, the muffled voices from Elliot and Savannah's room. What were they talking about? Were they making plans for the trip or discussing how best to manipulate me in a foreign country? I thought about Rebecca, how she loved to travel. New places clear the mind and open the heart, she used to say. Maybe that's what we needed right now, to clear the mind of accumulated resentments and mistrust, to open the heart to understand each other. With this hope, I finally fell asleep, not realizing that the next day would bring events that would turn our lives upside down. The day of departure came unexpectedly quickly. The morning was clear, with a cloudless sky, as if nature itself were blessing our journey. I woke up early, long before the others, and had time to drink a cup of coffee in silence, watching the first rays of sunlight painting the Colorado mountains pink. These moments of solitude were especially precious before the upcoming 2 weeks of constant communication with my family. The day before, I had picked up all my documents from the travel agency: plane tickets, hotel vouchers, insurance. I carefully folded them in a leather folder that I had used when I was teaching at the university. All 4 tickets for me, Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey were on me. It was a hefty sum, especially considering the high-end hotels I'd chosen, but I didn't spare the money. If this trip was going to help repair my relationship with my son, it was worth every penny I spent. Slowly, the house began to wake up. Savannah was the first to come down to the kitchen, unusually lively for early morning. "Good morning, Brookston," she exclaimed, smiling broadly. What a wonderful day to begin a journey. Her enthusiasm seemed genuine, and for a moment I allowed myself the hope that this trip would indeed bring us together. Audrey appeared soon after, also in high spirits, though I could still see the calculating glint in her eyes that I'd learned to recognize in the months we lived together. Elliot came down last, yawning and a little annoyed at the early rise, but even he seemed less sullen than usual. "Everyone ready for the big adventure?" I asked, trying to strike a positive tone. "You bet we are," Savannah said, putting toast on Elliot's plate. "I was up all night with excitement. Paris, Rome, Venice. It's going to be unforgettable." Breakfast passed in an unusually friendly atmosphere. We discussed the itinerary, the sites we were going to visit, the restaurants where we planned to dine. Even Audrey showed interest, asking about shopping in Milan, which I had added to the program especially for her and Savannah. After breakfast, everyone dispersed to their rooms to finish packing. Our flight was scheduled for 16 o'clock, but I insisted that we leave early. The drive to the Denver airport was about an hour and a half, plus we needed time to check in and go through all the formalities. At 12 o'clock, I ordered a minivan cab so we wouldn't have to leave the car in the long-term airport parking lot. We loaded our suitcases. Savannah and Audrey each took 2 huge ones, as if we were moving permanently rather than going on a 2-week vacation, and hit the road. The drive passed in animated conversation. Savannah asked about European fashion, Audrey asked about restaurants and stores, and Elliot even remembered a few episodes from our last trip when he was 12. "Remember that street artist in Paris who painted my portrait?" he asked with unexpected warmth in his voice. "My mother was delighted with it and hung it in a frame in my room. Of course I remember, I answered, my heart filling with joy at this glimpse of the old Elliot. The painter said you had the face of a future philosopher. Yes, and you noticed then that philosophy is also the science of the stars, only in a metaphorical sense. Elliot smiled, and it was a real smile, without the coldness I'd grown accustomed to over the past year. We arrived at the airport in good time, 3 hours before our flight. Check-in had already begun, and we made our way to the counter, where I presented our documents and ticket folder. 4 tickets to Rome, I told the airline attendant. The check-in procedure went smoothly. We were given our boarding passes and our luggage was checked in. Afterward, we went to the waiting area where I suggested we grab a bite to eat before the long flight. At the airport cafe, Audrey and Savannah excused themselves to the ladies' room, leaving Elliot and I alone. It was a rare moment when we could talk without their presence. You know, Dad, Elliot began abruptly, twirling his coffee cup in his hands. I wanted to say, thank you for this trip. It's very generous of you. I looked at my son, trying to see the sincerity in his eyes. What I saw was reassuring. There was something of the boy I remembered in them. I just want us to be a family again, Elliot, I said quietly. These last few months have been difficult. Elliot looked away as if embarrassed. Yeah, I guess Savannah and Audrey and I can be difficult neighbors sometimes. Difficult neighbors. It was the first semblance of acknowledgement of the problems that came with their move. I wanted to expand on the topic, to ask him directly about Savannah and Audrey's manipulations and how they were turning him against me. But at that moment, the women returned and the moment was gone. After grabbing a bite to eat, we headed to the gate. We were about an hour away from our flight, and I decided it was a good time to hand out tickets and paperwork to everyone. We sat down in the waiting area and I opened my leather folder. Okay, here are your tickets and hotel documents, I said, pulling out the papers. I made copies for everyone, just in case. I started handing out the papers when I noticed Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey exchanging strange looks. Something in their behavior alerted me, but I continued on. Elliot, here's your kit. Savannah, this is yours. Audrey, for you. Suddenly, Elliot leaned forward sharply and snatched not only his envelope out of my hands, but all the others, including my own. You know what, Dad? He said, and his voice changed, cold and mocking. We're going to fly away without you. I froze, not believing my ears. Elliot rose to his feet, holding all the tickets, and looked down at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, a mixture of triumph and contempt. What does that mean, Elliot? I asked, feeling my heart start to race. It means, Savannah interjected, rising to stand beside my husband, that we're tired of waiting for you to share your fortune. We deserve a vacation after a year of fiddling with you. Fussing? I asked, still unable to comprehend what was happening. Exactly, Audrey said, her face contorted with contempt. A year of your habits, your boring stories about the stars, your stinginess. You have no idea what it's like. Savannah and Audrey laughed, their laughter sounding harsh and unpleasant in the noisy airport hall. A few passengers turned in our direction, but quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved in someone else's conflict. But I paid for this trip, I said, feeling incredibly stupid and helpless. All the tickets, all the hotels. Exactly, Elliot exclaimed with a nasty smile. You paid for it, and we'll enjoy it. Fair enough, isn't it? Considering how many years you've been a lousy father, consider it compensation. I looked at my son and didn't recognize him. Where was that boy who marveled at the stars? That young man who, despite our differences, still had some respect for me? A stranger stood before me with a face contorted with anger and eyes full of contempt. Elliot, I said quietly, I don't believe you really mean that. It was them, I nodded toward Savannah and Audrey, that turned you against me. No one turned anyone against me, Elliot snapped at me. I just finally saw you for what you really are, a selfish, controlling old man who thinks only of himself. Don't worry, Brookston, Savannah added with fake concern in her voice. We'll bring you back a souvenir from Paris. Maybe a little Eiffel Tower for your junk collection? They laughed again, all three of them, as if they had rehearsed this scene in advance. And maybe they had. Maybe they'd been planning this from the beginning, from the moment I suggested the trip. I can call the airline right now and cancel the tickets, I said, trying to maintain some dignity. No, you can't, Audrey replied with a triumphant smile. They're non-refundable, remember? You chose that fare to save money. She was right. I did choose the non-refundable tickets to save money. Even if I called the airline right now, the most I could do is refund some of the airport taxes, but not the cost of the tickets themselves. You can't fly without your passport, I said, remembering that I still had my passports. Oh, you mean these? Elliot pulled 4 passports out of his jacket pocket and waved them in front of my face. I took them out of your safe yesterday. You're still using Mom's birthday as a code? How predictable. I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. My son wasn't just betraying me at this moment. He appeared to have prepared for this betrayal in advance, thoroughly and cold-bloodedly. What are you going to do when you get back? I asked, trying to collect my thoughts. You're still living in my house, in case you've forgotten. Oh, about that, Savannah said. We thought it might be time for you to move to a more appropriate place. You know, Sun Valley Nursing Home has great reviews. We've already checked it out. And who's going to pay for that nursing home? I asked, feeling a wave of anger rising inside me. You, of course, Audrey answered, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You have more than enough resources, and we'll manage your finances while you enjoy a well-deserved vacation. They've thought of everything, every detail of this betrayal, and from the looks of it, they've been planning it for a long time. Dad, don't make that face, Elliot said with faint concern. You're the one who always said you had to adapt to new circumstances. So adapt. At that moment, the announcement was made that our flight was boarding. Savannah and Audrey picked up their carry-on bags, ready to head for the gate. We should go, Savannah said, fixing her hair. Ciao, Brookston. Don't miss us. Elliot, I called out as they turned to leave. Do you really want to do this to your father? My son turned and looked at me with an expression I couldn't describe as anything but cold satisfaction. You were never a real father, he said quietly but clearly. You were busy with your stars, your books, your career. I was just an extension of your perfect life. So yeah, I'm more than willing to do that. With those words, he turned around and followed Savannah and Audrey to the gate. I remained seated, stunned and devastated, watching my son and the 2 women who had turned him into a man I didn't recognize disappear into the crowd of passengers. I don't remember how I got home. I think I hailed a cab, mechanically called the address and stared out the window the whole way, unable to see the scenery behind the glass. The scene at the airport, every word, every mocking look, every scornful laugh, was replayed over and over in my mind. The house greeted me with an unaccustomed silence. No chatter in the kitchen, no TV in the living room, no muffled conversations behind closed doors. Just the ticking of the old floor clock that I had inherited from my parents, and the sound of the wind outside the windows. I went into my office and sat down in a chair without turning on the light. The darkness of the room matched the darkness that filled me from the inside. I felt betrayed, used, and worst of all, stupid. How could I not see it was coming to this? How could I hope that going to Europe would make a difference when they had long ago decided what they would do to me? The most painful part of this betrayal was Elliot's involvement. I could understand Savannah and Audrey's self-interest. After all, they were strangers who had come to my house for a specific purpose. But Elliot, my son, my flesh and blood, how could he turn into the man I saw at the airport today? I spent the night without sleep, sitting in a chair in my office. I didn't even have the strength to go up to the bedroom. I thought about Rebecca, about what she would say if she saw what our son had become. I remembered Elliot the child, his excitement at seeing the stars through the telescope, his laughter, his questions about everything. Where had that boy disappeared to? Or maybe he never existed and I was just seeing what I wanted to see. By morning, my thoughts had cleared. Shock and pain gave way to cold determination. I realized I couldn't let them use me anymore. If Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey thought I was just a source of money and free housing, it was time to show them that they had seriously miscalculated. The first thing I did was call my attorney, Hampton Cole, who I'd worked with for over 20 years. Despite the early hour, it was only 6 in the morning, he answered after the third ringtone. Brookston? There was surprise in his voice. Is something wrong? Hampton, I need your help, I said, feeling my voice sound unusually firm. Today, It's about my house and my will. Cole, accustomed to my usually measured manner, realized the seriousness of the situation at once. "I'll be at your place at 9, he said without further question. I spent the next 2 hours gathering all the documents I could possibly need. Title deeds, bank statements, insurance policies, investment portfolios. Everything that made up the material basis of my life, and that was so appealing to my significant others. Hampton arrived exactly at 9 o'clock, as promised. An older man with shrewd eyes and graying temples, he was not only my lawyer, but perhaps the only person I could call a friend. "Tell me," he said, sitting in the chair across from me in his office. And I did. About everything. The moving of Elliot and Savannah, the arrival of Audrey, the gradual change in the atmosphere of the house, the overheard conversations and the plans to send me to a nursing home. And finally, the betrayal at the airport yesterday. Hampton listened in silence, nodding only occasionally. When I finished, he took off his glasses and wiped his eyes, looking genuinely upset. "I'm sorry, Brookston," he said quietly. "No one deserves to be treated like that, especially by their own son." "I want to evict them," I said, getting to the point. "All three of them, as soon as they get back from Europe, and change the will." "Are you sure?" Hampton asked, looking at me carefully. "It's a big step. Maybe we should talk to Elliot first." "I'm sure," I interrupted him. "You didn't see him yesterday, Hampton. That wasn't my son. It was someone else. Someone I don't know and don't want to know." Hampton nodded and pulled a laptop out of his briefcase. "Okay, let's start with the official eviction notice." We spent the next few hours working on the paperwork. Hampton drafted a formal eviction notice giving Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey 30 days to leave my house. Then we moved on to the will. Previously, I had planned to leave everything to Elliot, the house, the savings, the investments. Now I've decided to completely change my last will and testament. "Ooh, are you sure you want to deprive him of everything?" Hampton asked as we discussed the details. "Maybe I should leave something behind." I thought about it. Despite all the pain and anger, part of me still remembered the little boy who had once been my son. "Leave him $10,000, I finally said. "No more than that. Let the rest go toward a scholarship fund in my name for astronomy students. And the house. I want to sell the house and put the money into the fund." Hampton nodded and made all the changes to the paperwork. By noon, we were done. All the papers were drawn up, signed, and officially certified. Hampton had thoughtfully brought a notary with him. "What now?" Hampton asked, gathering the papers into his briefcase. "Now I wait for their return," I answered, feeling strangely calm. "They arrive in 2 weeks, and then they'll have to face the consequences of their actions." After Hampton left, I went up to the observatory and spent the rest of the day looking at the stars through the telescope. The sky was remarkably clear, as if purposely allowing me to find solace in the contemplation of eternity. Among the stars, everything seemed so insignificant. These small human betrayals, this pain, this loss. At night, I slept on the living room couch for the first time in years. I couldn't bring myself to go up to the bedroom, knowing that the people who were planning to get rid of me were still sleeping in the neighboring rooms. Strangely, I slept soundly, dreamless, as if my decision had brought some kind of release. In the morning, I woke up with a clear head and a firm intention. After a quick breakfast, I went to the bank, where I made some changes to my accounts, excluding Elliot as an heir in the event of my death. Then I went to the locksmith and ordered a complete replacement of the locks in the house. The new set was to be installed the very next day. When I got home, I started packing up Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey's things. I didn't throw them away or damage them, just put them neatly into boxes and suitcases, which I then moved to the garage. I didn't want anything to remind me of them in my house. By evening, when I was done with my things, I sat down in a chair in the living room, and for the first time in a long time, felt like the master of my own home. Yes, there was still the explanation with Elliot and the inevitable conflict ahead, but I was ready for it. No more manipulation, no more trying to use me. It was time to take back control of my life. I didn't know exactly what I would tell them when they returned from Europe, but I was sure of one thing. They would never again cross the threshold of my home as tenants. That chapter of my life was irrevocably closed. The 2 weeks of waiting flew by. I'd spent it cleaning up the house, not only physically clearing it of Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey, but mentally preparing for the inevitable confrontation. New locks were installed on all the doors, the alarm system was reprogrammed, and documents were safely tucked away in a safe deposit box. I left no loophole through which they could re-enter my life. I marked the day of their return on my calendar in red. That evening, I sat in my office looking through a scientific journal, but I couldn't concentrate on the articles. My thoughts kept returning to the upcoming scene. I imagined the surprise on their faces when they discovered the keys didn't fit the locks. I imagined the outrage that would be replaced by shock when they realized I was no longer playing by their rules. Around 9 p.m., I heard the sound of a cab pulling up, then muffled voices and laughter. They had returned, unaware of what awaited them. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the sounds outside. Soon there was the sound of a key trying to enter the keyhole, then another attempt, more insistent. Then a knock on the door, moderate at first, then louder and louder. "Dad!" Elliot's voice sounded irritated. "Open the door! Our keys don't work!" I didn't answer, continuing to sit in the dark. The knocking became more insistent. "Brookston!" It was Savannah's voice now. "We know you're home. The car's in the garage. Open up right now." I got up slowly and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. In the light of the street lamp, I could see the three of them, Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey, standing on the porch with their suitcases. They looked tanned and rested, but worry was starting to show on their faces. Finally, I turned on the hallway light and opened the door, leaving the latch on the chain. 3 pairs of eyes stared at me through the narrow slit. "Dad, what's going on?" Elliot asked, and I could hear the first trace of alarm in his voice. "Why did they change the locks?" "Because this is my house," I answered calmly. "And I decide who lives in it and who doesn't." "What nonsense!" Audrey exclaimed, stepping forward. "Open up at once. We're tired from the road." "I'm afraid you'll have to find another place to rest," I said in the same even tone of voice. "You don't live in this house anymore." There was a pause during which they seemed to realize what I meant. Then Savannah stepped forward, her face taking on the caring daughter. In law expression, she was so good at portraying. "Brookston, honey, you must not know what you're saying," she murmured. "We're your family." "Of course we live here. Where else would we live?" "Anywhere," I replied. "It's not my concern anymore. You have an official eviction notice." I slid the envelope of paperwork Hampton had prepared through the slot. "You have 30 days to find a new place to live. Until then, your belongings will be stored in the garage. You can pick them up at any time by calling me first." Elliot took the envelope and opened it, quickly running his eyes over the document. His face changed, becoming hard and threatening. "You can't do this," he said through gritted teeth. "We've lived here for over a year. We have rights." "You don't have any rights," I countered. "You didn't pay rent. You didn't sign a contract. You were guests, and now I'm asking you to leave." "You'll regret this, old man," Audrey interjected, her eyes narrowed with anger. "We'll tell everyone how you treat your own son." "Tell whoever you want," I shrugged. "Now, if you don't leave voluntarily, I'm calling the police." "The police?" Savannah let out a short laugh. "On your own son? Who would believe that?" "Shall we check it out?" I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and started dialing. It worked. Elliot grabbed Savannah's hand and said something quietly to her, and she reluctantly backed away. "This isn't over, Dad," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "You'll regret your decision." "Maybe," I said, "but not as much as I regretted letting you into my house." I closed the door with those words, and I heard Audrey cursing. A short time later, there was the sound of a cab pulling away. They were gone, at least for that night. The next few days passed in relative calm. I expected an immediate reaction. Calls, threats, attempts to break into the house. But nothing happened. This lull alarmed me more than the open conflict. What were they planning? What kind of strike were they preparing? On the 4th day after their return, the phone rang. It was Elliot, and his voice sounded unexpectedly conciliatory. "Dad, we need to talk," he said. "I understand that you're upset about what happened at the airport. I overreacted. Let's talk about this like adults." "We have nothing to talk about, Elliot," I said. "You've made your feelings about me clear, and I've made mine about you. That's the end of it." "Dad, please," he said, a pleading tone in his voice. "We're having trouble finding a place to stay." We're staying at a motel, but we can't afford to stay long. We need to at least get our stuff. I told you your things are in the garage. You can come pick them up anytime. Just call ahead. How about we just talk, just you and me, without Savannah and Mom? Yeah, I miss you, Dad. It was low even for Elliot to try to play on my daddy issues after everything that had happened, but I decided not to show how hurt I was by his words. If you really have something to say, you can come over tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, alone, without Savannah and Audrey. Thanks, Dad. His voice filled with genuine joy, which I was sure was as fake as his sudden longing for me. I'll be there, I promise. The next day at 2 o'clock sharp, Elliot showed up at my house. I watched him through my office window, noting that he had arrived alone, as we had agreed. He was dressed better than usual, in a white shirt and dark pants, as if for a job interview. His hair was neatly combed, his beard trimmed. He was clearly preparing for this meeting. I opened the door but didn't invite him in, instead stepping out onto the porch. It was a warm summer day, and I preferred to talk outdoors. Thanks for agreeing to meet me, Dad, Elliot began, extending his hand for a handshake. I ignored the gesture, sat down on the bench by the porch, and pointed to the seat next to me. Go ahead, I'm listening. Elliot sat down, rubbing his hands together nervously. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Dad, I know I hurt you. What happened at the airport? It was awful. I don't know what came over me. I'm so sorry. You are? I asked, not hiding my skepticism. Are you sorry that you snatched the tickets and said you'd go without me? Or are you sorry that I wasn't helpless enough to let you keep using me? Dad, that's not fair. Elliot shook his head. Yes, what I did was wrong. But you know the influence Savannah and her mother have over me. They manipulated me, made me say and do things I didn't really mean. So now you're blaming it on them? I couldn't hold back a bitter chuckle. Convenient. No, I'm not shifting the blame. Elliot looked almost genuinely remorseful. It was my fault, and I apologize. Please, Dad, give us another chance. We can fix this. There's nothing to fix, Elliot, I said firmly. What we had between us is broken, and I don't see any way to fix it. But we're family, he exclaimed with sudden passion. Each other's only family. After Mom, we're the only ones left. Family doesn't do what you did, I said quietly. Family doesn't plan to put you in a nursing home to get your money. The family doesn't go through your papers, doesn't try to manipulate you, doesn't humiliate you in front of others. Just because we share the same last name and DNA doesn't make us family, Elliot. Family is more than that. My son was speechless for a moment, then tried again. Dad, we were upset, angry. We said a lot of unnecessary things, but we can start over. I promise it'll be different. No, I shook my head. You don't understand. It's not about what you said or did at the airport. It's about who you've become, or who you've always been, but I didn't want to see that. I don't trust you, Elliot, and I don't think I'll ever be able to trust you again. What can I do? There was desperation in his voice, but I couldn't tell if it was sincere. How can I prove that I've changed? You can't, I answered simply. Some things you can't fix. This is one of them. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Elliot spoke again, and his voice changed, becoming colder. Is this the final decision? Yes, I nodded. It is. Then you leave me no choice. He stood up, his expression hard. We're going to sue you for wrongful eviction, for psychological abuse. We'll tell everyone that you're out of your mind, that you're a danger to yourself and others. We'll get custody of you. This is the true face of my son. The mask of concern and remorse fell away, revealing what had been beneath it all along. You can try, I said calmly. I have recordings of your conversations about how you plan to manipulate my medication to make me more compliant. There is testimony from my attorney about your plan to send me to a nursing home against my will. There is the medical report of my excellent physical and mental health that I received last week. So go ahead, Elliot. Sue me. Let's see who comes out the winner. Elliot went pale. Obviously, he didn't expect me to be so well prepared. You're bluffing, he said, but there was no confidence in his voice. Check it out, I shrugged. If you start a legal war, I'll go all the way. And it won't be 30 days to evict me. It'll be an order forbidding me from coming near my house. And a total disinheritance. Down to the last dime. Elliot clenched his fists, his face contorted with rage. You'll regret this, old man, he hissed. You'll die alone, and no one will come to your funeral. Maybe, I agreed. But at least I'll live and die on my terms, not yours. With those words, I stood up and headed for the door, signaling that the conversation was over. Elliot stood still for a few seconds, then abruptly turned and walked to his car. A minute later, he drove off, leaving me alone on the porch of my house. I expected a real war to break out after that conversation. But instead, there was a strange calm. No calls, no visits, no threats. A week later, Elliot called and dryly asked when he could pick up his stuff from the garage. We agreed on a time, and the next day he arrived with a small truck. Savannah and Audrey stayed in the car, not wanting to meet me face to face. The eviction process went surprisingly smoothly. Elliot and the assistant he had hired loaded my things into the truck without saying a word to me. I watched the process from my office window with mixed feelings. Part of me still hoped that Elliot would come to his senses, that he would realize how low he'd fallen. But the other part realized that wasn't going to happen. The man I saw now loading boxes into the truck was no longer the boy I had once known and loved. When they left, I slowly walked around the house, room by room, as if reacquainting myself with it. It was a strange feeling of emptiness and liberation at the same time. In every room there were traces of their presence, marks on the walls, stains on the carpet, empty spaces where their furniture used to stand. But with each step, I could feel the house becoming mine again. The first few days in the empty house were unusual. The silence I used to appreciate so much now seemed oppressive at times. I caught myself listening to sounds that were no longer there. Footsteps upstairs, voices in the kitchen, the sound of the TV in the living room. But gradually I was getting used to being alone again, finding in it a freedom I had forgotten. I returned to my old habits, morning cups of coffee by the window overlooking the mountains, long hours at the observatory, reading scientific journals in the study. But something had changed. I no longer felt like an old professor, living out my days in silence and oblivion. In a strange way, the betrayal of Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey had awakened in me some new energy, a desire to act, to change my life. I started small. I invited old colleagues from the university over for dinner. They were surprised by my call. I had rarely socialized in recent years, but gladly accepted the invitation. The evening passed in lively conversations about science, politics, art. I discovered that I could still hold an interesting conversation, that my mind was not rusty from loneliness and age. I then contacted the university and proposed a lecture series for astronomy students. The idea was met with enthusiasm. It turned out that many young scientists knew my work and wanted to hear in person the legend of astronomy, as the dean of the faculty unexpectedly called me. Day by day, I filled the void left by the departure of my family with new things to do, new acquaintances, new interests. Sometimes in the evenings, looking at the stars through the telescope, I still felt a prick of pain, remembering Elliot the child, his delight at seeing cosmic bodies. But that pain became more and more dulled, turning into a kind of light sadness for what could have been, but wasn't. About a month after Elliot and company were evicted, I received a letter from my attorney, Hampton Cole. He reported that Elliot had attempted to contest my new will, claiming that I was incapacitated at the time I made it. The attempt failed, of course. The medical report on my health, obtained immediately after the airport incident, left no doubt about my sanity. But the very fact of the attempt suggested that Elliot was not going to give up so easily. At the end of the letter, Hampton added a postscript. By the way, your son recently lost his job at a travel agency. Rumor has it that he was fired for trying to embezzle clients' money. I don't know if that matters to you, but I thought you should know. Strangely, this news didn't bring me any satisfaction, only sadness at the realization of the kind of man my son had become, and gratitude that I'd seen his true colors before it was too late. Another week later, I ran into Savannah at the supermarket. She was standing in the checkout line, looking tired and annoyed. When she saw me, she froze for a moment, then quickly turned away, pretending not to recognize me. I calmly walked past, feeling no anger or desire for confrontation. This woman who had once planned to run my life was now just a stranger randomly encountered in a store. That evening, sitting in my office with a glass of good whiskey, I reflected on the strange irony of life. Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey wanted to use me, to take away my control over my own life. But in the end, their actions had had the exact opposite result. I felt more alive, more free, more in control of my destiny than I had in years before. Maybe, I thought, looking at the amber liquid in my glass. Sometimes you have to lose something valuable to gain something even more important. I'd lost the illusion of family, but I'd gained real freedom and a new meaning to life. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that the future might not just be a continuation of the past, but something completely new and unexpected. Something to look forward to with interest, not fear or apathy. The house no longer seemed empty. It was full of possibilities, and I was ready to explore them. Fall in Colorado Springs has always been my favorite time of year. The mountains seem to flash orange and gold. The air becomes crystal clear, and the sky becomes incredibly deep and blue. This year, the fall colors seemed especially vibrant, as if nature was reflecting the changes that were happening in my life. It had been 2 months since Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey had left my house. In that time, I've managed to not only get back to my normal routine, but I've also found a new purpose. An idea that had occurred to me back on the day of their eviction was slowly taking shape into a concrete plan. I wanted my fortune, the result of decades of university work and successful investments, to serve something more than just enriching my ungrateful son and his mercantile family. One morning I called Hampton Cole and set up a meeting in his office. Although we had already changed the will immediately after the airport incident, I wanted to discuss the larger changes that required detailed legal drafting. Hampton's office was in an old building downtown, brick with high ceilings and wood paneling on the walls. Hampton himself, as elegant as ever in his tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, met me at the entrance. "Brookston, you look younger," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Loneliness has done you good." "Not loneliness, Hampton," I replied, walking into his office. "Freedom from toxic relationships. It's different." We settled into comfortable leather chairs, and the receptionist brought us coffee. Hampton pulled out a notepad, ready to take notes. "So what other changes do you want to make to the will?" he asked, looking at me intently. "You've already disinherited most of Elliot's estate, leaving him only a token amount." "I want to go further," I said, sipping my hot coffee. "Not just disinherit him, but create something positive out of the situation. I have an idea to start a fund to support young astronomers." Hampton raised his eyebrows but said nothing, letting me continue. "You see, I've been involved in science all my life, helped discover several star systems, published dozens of papers, but there's never been a true successor to my work. Elliot was never interested in astronomy, despite all my attempts to instill in him a love of the stars." I paused, remembering the rare moments when little Elliot would still show interest in my stories about the cosmos. How quickly it passed, replaced by indifference and even irritation. So I thought, why not create a foundation that would support talented students who are really passionate about astronomy? Scholarships, research grants, funding for expeditions to observatories around the world. Something that would help young scientists avoid the financial difficulties I myself faced early in my career. Hampton nodded, making notes in his notebook. "It's a noble idea, Brookston, and legally feasible. We can set up a trust to manage your estate after you die. Define clear criteria for scholarship recipients. Form a board of trustees." "I wanted to start working while I'm alive," I interrupted him. "I don't see the point in waiting until I'm dead to start doing something useful." "All the better," Hampton smiled. "You'll be able to participate personally in the selection of candidates to see the fruits of your efforts. But it will require a more complicated structure. Some of the money will have to be transferred to the fund now, and the rest through a bequest." "That's exactly how I envisioned it," I nodded. "I have some savings that I can allocate immediately. The rest, the house, the main investments, will go into the fund after my death." We spent several hours discussing the details of the future fund. Hampton asked precise questions, helping to shape my fuzzy ideas into a concrete plan. Who would be on the board of trustees? What would be the criteria for selecting scholarship recipients? How would there be transparency in how the funds would be spent? By the end of the meeting, we had an outline of the foundation's charter and a plan of action for the coming months. It's going to take some time, Hampton warned, setting aside his pen. Starting a foundation is not a quick process. You'll need to register a nonprofit organization, get tax exemptions, set up the whole management structure. I have time, I smiled. Despite what Elliot and the company hope, I'm not going to die anytime soon. Hampton laughed and shook my hand. I'll get right on it, he promised. And Brookston, I'm glad you found a new purpose after everything that's happened. As I left Hampton's office, I felt unusually light. It was as if the weight I'd been carrying on my shoulders all these years, the disappointment in my son, the pain of his betrayal, began to melt away, giving way to something new and bright. The idea for the foundation wasn't just a way to disinherit Elliot, it was a way to create a legacy that would outlive me. In the weeks that followed, I worked diligently with Hampton and his legal team to create the foundation. We determined the size of the initial endowment, large enough for the foundation to begin operating immediately, but leaving me with the means to live comfortably. We selected the first members of the Board of Trustees, my former university colleagues whose integrity and dedication to science I trusted completely. We developed criteria for the selection of scholarship recipients, among which the main criteria were not academic achievements, but a true passion for astronomy and originality of thinking. The name for the fund came unexpectedly, the Rebecca Lowell Fund for Young Astronomers. Rebecca, my late wife, always supported my passion for the stars, even when it meant less time with my family. She deserved this memory. One evening, while reviewing foundation documents in my office, I heard the doorbell ring. It was late, about 9 p.m., and I wasn't expecting visitors. Cautiously approaching the door, I looked through the peephole and was surprised to see Elliot. He was standing alone, without Savannah and Audrey, and he looked lost. I hesitated for a few seconds, not knowing if I should open it. Our last meeting had ended in threats from him, and I wasn't sure I was ready for another conflict. But something in his posture, the slumped shoulders, the drooping head, made me open the door, leaving the chain in place. Elliot? I asked through the narrow slit. What are you doing here? Dad, his voice sounded hoarse, as if he'd been silent or shouting for a long time. Can I come in? I need to talk to you. About what? I took my time removing the chain. If you've come with more threats or demands, you're wasting your time. No, not that, he shook his head. Yeah, I came to apologize. For real. And to tell you something you should know. Something in his tone made me believe he was sincere this time. Or maybe I just wanted to believe it. I removed the chain and opened the door, letting my son into the house. Elliot didn't look his best. Gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and wrinkled clothes. Clothes. It was like he hadn't slept in days. We went into the living room, and I pointed him to the couch, taking the chair across from him. I'm listening, I said, folding my hands in my lap. Elliot was silent for a long moment, staring at the floor. Then he took a deep breath and began. I heard about the foundation. About you creating it instead of leaving the inheritance to me. I tensed, expecting an explosion of indignation, of accusation. But Elliot continued, unexpectedly calm. At first I was furious. I thought you were doing this out of spite to punish me. But then I started thinking about why. And what I did to you. His voice shook and I saw him clench his fists, trying to contain his emotions. Savannah and I broke up, he said abruptly. Or rather, she left me for some rich businessman she met at the spa where she works. Took almost all the money from our joint account. Audrey, of course, left with her. I was silent, not knowing what to say. Part of me felt satisfied. Savannah had shown her true colors to Elliot too, not just me. But the other part sympathized with my son, who looked truly broken. And you know what I realized? Elliot continued with a bitter chuckle. I realized that all this time I'd been just a tool for them, a way to get to your money. Savannah never loved me. She just used me like I did, like we used you. He looked up at me with eyes full of pain and shame. I'm sorry, Dad. I know this won't fix anything. I know you'll never be able to trust me again. But I wanted you to know that I realized what we did. And I'm so fucking ashamed. I looked at my son, not knowing whether to believe him or not. He had tried to manipulate me in the past by feigning remorse, but something in his voice, in his gaze, was different this time. More genuine. "Why are you here, Elliot? I asked you straight out. What do you want?" "Nothing." He shook his head. "I mean, not money, not an inheritance, not a return to the house. I just wanted to say that I understand now why you're starting this foundation, and that I think it's the right thing to do." Those words took me by surprise. I was expecting anything. Requests, demands, threats, but not this admission. "I know about my mom's foundation," Elliot continued quietly. "Hampton happened to mention it when I was trying to find out the details of the new will. And you know," I thought, "it's a good thing. Mom would be happy. She always said to help those who really wanted to learn." He fell silent, looking at his hands. I was silent too, not knowing what to say to this unexpected show of understanding. "I'm not asking you to put me back in the will," Elliot said after a pause. "I don't deserve it, but I was thinking, maybe someday we could just talk, like we used to. Not about money, not about the house, just like father and son." His voice shook on the last words, and I saw tears glisten in his eyes. It took me by surprise. Elliot hadn't cried since he was a teenager. Even at his mother's funeral, he'd been dry and detached. "I'll think about it," I said finally, not ready to make a promise I might break. "Right now, I needed time." Elliot nodded, wiping his eyes quickly with his sleeve. "I understand. Thank you for listening to me. And again, I'm sorry for everything." He stood up, ready to leave. I rose from my chair too, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Distrust, sympathy, remnants of resentment, and a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of hope. We reached the door in silence. Elliot turned to me as he took the handle. "You know, I remembered the other day when you and I went to the Lowell Observatory in Arizona with my mom. I was about 10 years old, I think, and you showed me Jupiter through the telescope, its stripes and the great red spot. I was so impressed, I couldn't sleep all night. Do you remember?" I remembered that day very well, one of the rare moments when I felt like Elliot really shared my passion for astronomy. "I remember," I nodded. "You said you wanted to be an astronaut and go to Jupiter." "Yes," Elliot smiled weakly. "And you explained why it was impossible. Too far away, too dangerous. But you said that I could study it from Earth, through telescopes, and that it's a kind of journey too." I didn't expect him to remember those words, that they meant anything to him at all. "I was stupid, Dad," Elliot said quietly. "Stupid and blind. I didn't see what a treasure I had, a father who showed me the stars." With those words, he opened the door and walked out into the night without looking back. I stood on the doorstep, watching him walk to his car parked at the curb. Something in his gait, in his slumped shoulders, spoke of real remorse. Or was I seeing what I wanted to see again? The next morning, I got a text from the Hamptons. It turned out that Elliot had come to his office shortly before his visit to me, but not to threaten or demand, but to learn more about the foundation and, to offer his help in organizing it. He seemed genuinely interested, Hampton wrote, said he wanted to do at least something right in his life. I didn't believe him, of course, and sent him away, but thought you should know. That message got me thinking, what if Elliot's remorse was real? What if losing Savannah and realizing how she'd used him had really opened his eyes to his own actions? Could I give him another chance? Not as an heir, not as a tenant in my house, but as a son? I didn't have time to ponder these questions, because that evening something unexpected happened. The doorbell rang, and on the doorstep I found Savannah and Audrey. Both were dressed with a defiant elegance, as if for a business meeting. Savannah was holding a bouquet of flowers, and Audrey was holding a bottle of expensive whiskey, judging by the packaging. "Brookston, darling," Savannah exclaimed with the same fake smile I remembered so well. "We're here to make up." I stared at them, unable to hide my surprise. After everything that had happened, after Savannah had left Elliot for another man, they dared to come to me with this obvious pretense. "Why are you here?" I asked bluntly, not inviting them in. "We heard about the foundation," Audrey said, stepping forward, "that you were going to give all your money to some strange students instead of taking care of your family." And we thought, Savannah chimed in, that maybe we were all a little overreacting. Family is family, right? You can't just give up on your loved ones like that. I looked at them, and suddenly I felt funny. So transparent were their motives, so obvious was their greed. They didn't even try to hide the fact that they were only here for the money. What about your new rich friend? I asked Savannah. The businessman you left Elliot for? Savannah was confused for a moment, but quickly pulled herself together. It was a misunderstanding, she said with feigned regret. I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. Elliot is the only man I love. What a coincidence, I said dryly. You realized it right when you found out about the foundation. Look, Brookston, Audrey intervened, her voice sharp. Let's get this straight. You can't just give your money to some strangers when your own son could be left penniless. It's, it's wrong. Wrong? I raised my eyebrows. Was planning to send me to a nursing home against my will right? Or snatching my tickets from me at the airport and screaming that you were leaving without me? We've already apologized for that, Savannah lied, though I hadn't heard any apology from her. People make mistakes, but family's supposed to forgive, isn't it? You know what's interesting, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. Elliot came to see me yesterday, and unlike you, he didn't ask for money or an inheritance. He just wanted to apologize. And you know what? I almost believed him. Savannah and Audrey's faces changed when I mentioned Elliot. Anger flashed in Savannah's eyes, quickly replaced by a fake smile. Of course he came, she said. We told him to do it. Family should stick together. You didn't even know he was here, I shook my head. You thought he was still sitting at home mourning your departure, but he had the strength to admit his mistakes, which I can't say for you. Look, man, Audrey was getting impatient, her face contorted with anger. You can't just go and... I can, I interrupted her firmly. And I've already done it. The foundation is set up, the papers are signed. You're too late. But the will, Savannah exclaimed. You couldn't have changed the will already. I could and I did, I said calmly. Everything I have goes to the foundation, except for a small amount for Elliot. Not for you, just for him. Savannah and Audrey exchanged a look of desperation. Their last chance for easy money was disappearing before their eyes. It's not fair, Audrey exclaimed, no longer trying to hide her greed. We've spent so much time putting up with your antics, taking care of you. You used me, I corrected her, or tried to. And now that your plan had failed, you came up with this pathetic performance, hoping I was naive enough to believe in your sudden love for your family. I shook my head, feeling not so much angry as tired of their pretense. Leave, I said firmly, and don't come back. I won't change my mind. You'll regret this, Audrey hissed, her face contorted with rage. We'll find a way to contest your will. We'll prove that you were incapacitated when you signed it. Try, I shrugged. Hampton has already prepared all the necessary medical reports proving my full capacity. So good luck. With that, I closed the door, leaving them standing on the porch with flowers and whiskey. Through the window, I watched them argue furiously. Then Savannah tossed the bouquet to the ground, and they left without looking back. Back in the office, I sat down at the desk where the foundation's documents lay. Detailed bylaws, lists of potential scholarship recipients, plans for the future. I ran my fingers over the name, the Rebecca Lowell Foundation for Young Astronomers, and felt a warmth spill into my chest. This was the right thing to do. Not just a way to deprive Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey of money, but an opportunity to create something meaningful that would outlive me. And for the first time in a long time, I thought that maybe all was not lost for Elliot. Not as an heir, but as a man who, after going through betrayal and loss, had finally begun to see his mistakes. Who might still remember that day at Lowell Observatory when we'd looked at Jupiter together. I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive him or trust him again. But maybe somewhere in the future, there was still a chance for us, not to rebuild our old relationship, but to create something new, based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. As for Savannah and Audrey, everything was clear with them. Their visit only confirmed what I already knew. For them, I had always been just a source of money, an object of manipulation, and today they had made that very clear, not only to me, but to themselves as well. 6 months flew by like a day. The early spring in Colorado Springs was especially beautiful, with the mountains still covered with snow on their peaks, contrasting with the bright green of the waking valleys. My window had a magnificent view of the scene, and I began each morning with a cup of coffee and contemplation of nature, experiencing a deep sense of peace. More changes occurred in my life in those 6 months than in the previous 10 years. With Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey gone, it was as if I had been freed from shackles that I hadn't noticed while they held me back. My home, once a battleground, had become a sanctuary again, not an isolated hermit's fortress, but an open space for new possibilities. The first major change was my return to academic work. Back in the fall, I contacted former colleagues at the university and offered to help with a research project related to the study of exoplanets. I was accepted with enthusiasm, despite my age. It turned out that my expertise was still valued in the scientific community. I came to the university 3 times a week, where I was given a small office. I worked with young scientists, checked their calculations, shared my experience, and sometimes contributed my own ideas, which to my surprise often turned out to be innovative. Astronomy had not stood still during my absence, but the fundamental principles remained the same, and my understanding of these principles helped me to find unexpected solutions to modern problems. In February, our group managed to discover a new exoplanet in a system that I had once studied myself when I was still an active researcher. It was a strange feeling, like meeting an old friend after a long separation. When the first data appeared on the computer confirming the presence of the planet, I felt a rush of emotion that I hadn't felt in a long time. Young colleagues joked that the planet should be named in my honor, but I suggested naming it Rebecca, in memory of my wife, who always supported my passion for the stars. In parallel with my scientific work, my fund to support young astronomers has developed. Hampton Cole did an excellent job on the legal side, and by January, all the formalities were sorted out. We held our first competition for fellowships and grants, and I was personally involved in the selection of applicants. There were many really talented and enthusiastic young people among the applications, but I was particularly moved by the story of a girl named Lilith Chang, a student from a poor family who had been obsessed with space since childhood and built homemade telescopes from improvised materials. Her passion reminded me of my youth, when I too was building primitive astronomical instruments without the means to buy professional equipment. Lilith was one of the Foundation's first scholarship recipients, and I took her on as my personal mentor. We spent several hours each week in my home observatory, studying the starry sky and discussing the latest discoveries in astronomy. Her bright eyes that lit up at the sight of distant galaxies, her keen mind, and her endless questions took me back to the days when I was just beginning my own journey in science. One evening, after a particularly successful observation of the Orion Nebula, Lilith suddenly asked, "Professor Lowell, why did you set up this foundation? Don't you have any children to pass on your legacy to?" The question caught me off guard. I rarely talked about my personal life with colleagues and students, and I had never told anyone but Hampton about the events surrounding Elliot. "I have a son," I answered after a pause, "but he has chosen a different path in life." "He's not interested in astronomy?" Lilith asked with such genuine surprise, as if she couldn't imagine how anyone could not be interested in the stars. "He used to be," I smiled, remembering little Elliot asking endless questions about the cosmos. "But then he was drawn to other things. More earthly." "It's a shame," Lilith said simply, "but I'm glad our foundation came into being. Otherwise, I would never have been able to continue my studies." Her words touched something deep inside me. Perhaps everything had really happened the way it was supposed to. Elliot's betrayal, however painful, had led to the creation of a foundation that now helped talented and passionate young scholars like Lilith. In addition to work and the foundation, I decided to finally fulfill a long-held dream of mine, to travel around Europe. Not the business tour of observatories that I did decades ago with Rebecca and little Elliot, but a real trip for pleasure, without schedule or commitment. In March, I bought tickets for April: Rome, Venice, Paris, Barcelona. The same itinerary I planned for a family trip a year ago. But this time I was flying alone, and strangely the thought didn't cause sadness, but rather a sense of freedom. Before I left, I received an unexpected call from Elliot. It had been almost 6 months since I'd last seen him, and he hadn't been in touch. I'd almost forgotten about his visit and his confession of remorse, thinking it was just another manipulation. "Dad," his voice sounded strangely tense. "I hear you're going to Europe." "Yes," I answered, surprised that he knew about my plans. "I'm leaving in a week." That's, that's great." I could sense the uncertainty in his tone. "I was thinking maybe I could join you. On me, of course. Just, spend some time together." I remained silent, pondering his offer. Part of me wanted to believe in Elliot's sincerity, that he was really trying to make things work. But the other part, the more cautious and wise part, reminded me of all the previous disappointments. "Why now, Elliot?" I asked bluntly. "Why now exactly did you decide to repair the relationship?" He hesitated, and I heard more in that pause than in any of his words. "Yeah, I just miss you, Dad," he said finally, "and I thought traveling was a good way to get to know each other again." "Did it have anything to do with your new business failing?" I asked, drawing on information I'd recently gotten from Hampton. After Savannah left, Elliot had tried to start his own travel agency, taking out a loan, but it hadn't worked out. A pause again, then a heavy sigh. "How do you know?" There was disappointment in his voice, but not surprise. He didn't deny the obvious. "It doesn't matter," I answered. "What matters is that you only come to me again when you need something. Not because you miss me, not because you want to reconnect. It's because you're having financial problems." "That's not true," he exclaimed with feigned indignation. "Yes, I'm struggling right now, but I really want to get back together. We could start over, Dad. Give each other another chance." I listened to his words and heard in them echoes of the same manipulations he'd used before. The same intonations, the same phrases about a new chance and a fresh start. Nothing had changed. He hadn't changed. "No, Elliot," I said firmly. "I'm going alone, and that's my final decision." "But Dad," he began with the same pleading tone he'd used in the past. "I said no," I repeated, feeling tired rather than angry. "I wish you well, but we've parted ways, and I think it's best for both of us." After this conversation, there was silence. No calls, no messages. I flew to Europe with a light heart, leaving behind not only my home, but also the weight of past relationships. The trip turned out to be exactly what I needed. I wandered the streets of Rome, enjoying the architecture and art, sailed on a gondola through the canals of Venice, soaking up the atmosphere of this amazing city, sat in cafes in Montmartre, watching Parisian life, sunbathed on the beaches of Barcelona, listening to the sound of the waves. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. On the contrary, I enjoyed the freedom of being able to decide for myself where to go, what to see, where to dine. No compromises, no manipulation, no tension. In Paris, I met an amazing woman, Eleanor Dupré, the widow of a French astrophysicist whose work I had once studied. She was a retired literature teacher with a sharp mind and a great sense of humor. We spent several evenings together discussing science, art, life. Eleanor invited me to join their group of older intellectuals who met once a month in different European cities to discuss books and ideas. "You would bring a fresh American perspective to our discussions," she said with that special French directness that I found endearing. I promised to think about that suggestion. The idea of spending part of the year in Europe, in the company of interesting people with a passion for science and art, seemed more and more appealing. When I returned to Colorado Springs in early May, I found myself looking at my home with new eyes. It was still my refuge, my fortress, but now I saw it also as a base for new adventures, rather than a final resting place. On my first night home, the doorbell rang. Opening it, I saw Elliot. He looked even worse than he had the last time we talked. Gaunt, with an unhealthy complexion, wearing crumpled clothes. "I know you don't want to see me," he started before I could say anything, "but I have nowhere else to go. The bank foreclosed on my apartment because of loan debts." "Yeah, I'm broke, Dad, completely." I looked at my son and felt a strange mixture of pity and detachment. This was the man I had once loved more than anyone in the world. Flesh and flesh to me. and at the same time a stranger, a man whose values and choices were diametrically opposed to mine. "What do you want, Elliot?" I asked you straight out. Can I, could I stay here for a while?" His voice shook. "Just a few weeks until I get back on my feet. I'll get a job, pay my rent. It's just, I have nowhere else to go." I stood in the doorway of my house, the house that had recently been the battleground between us. I remembered all the manipulation, all the betrayals, and at the same time I couldn't help but see my child in distress in front of me. "I can't let you back into my house, Elliot," I said finally. Too much had been said and done. Too many bridges burned. His face contorted with disappointment, but I continued. "However, I can help you in another way. I'll pay for a month's hotel and give you a small sum to get you back on your feet. But on one condition, you'll go to therapy. Professional help to deal with the patterns of behavior that led you to this situation." Elliot looked surprised by my offer. He was probably expecting either a complete rejection or an invitation to return to the house, but not this middle option. "Therapy?" he asked incredulously. "Do you think I'm crazy?" "No," I shook my head. "I think you're a person who hasn't learned healthy relationships and responsibility for your decisions, and you need help to change that. If you really want to start a new life, this is the first step." Elliot was silent for a long time, mulling over my words. Then, to my surprise, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll take it. Thank you for your help." We worked out the details. I booked him a room at a decent hotel nearby, gave him the contacts of a good therapist recommended by a friend from university, and wrote him a check for enough money to start a new life, but not so much that he could go back to his old habits. As Elliot left, I felt strangely relieved. Not because I'd gotten rid of him, but because I'd found a way to help without sacrificing my own well-being or returning to the toxic relationships of the past. I didn't know if Elliot would take this chance for real or just take the money and disappear, but it was already his choice, his path. I did the best I could while maintaining healthy boundaries. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my new life, working at the university, developing the foundation, meeting interesting people. I thought more and more about Eleanor Dupre's offer to join their European circle, and even began planning a trip to France for the fall. One evening, sitting in my observatory looking at the stars, I reflected on the strange turns life takes. A year ago, I was a lonely old man, trapped in my own house with people planning to get rid of me for money. Now, however, I felt more alive and free than I had at any time in decades. The breakup with Elliot, Savannah, and Audrey, as painful as it had been, had turned out to be a beginning, not an end. The beginning of a new chapter in which I was not just an old man with money, but a man with a purpose, with new connections, with plans for the future. I remembered the words Rebecca had once said to me, "Sometimes you have to let go of what's holding you back in order to move forward." At the time, she was referring to my attachment to a certain scientific theory that kept me from seeing new possibilities. But now those words have taken on new meaning. By letting go of a toxic relationship with my son and his family, I had freed myself from the shackles of the past and opened up to new horizons. That didn't mean I stopped loving Elliot. I still had hope that he would find his way to a better life. But I realized that my love shouldn't turn into dependency, into allowing myself to be manipulated, into sacrificing my own well-being. Sometimes the healthiest kind of love is setting clear boundaries and letting the other person be responsible for their decisions, even if that means watching him make mistakes without intervening. Looking at the stars through the telescope, I felt a surprising calmness. These ancient luminaries, which I had studied all my life, had witnessed countless human dramas, joys, and tragedies. Against their backdrop, my own problems seemed small and transitory. Ultimately, I thought, life is not about the material goods we accumulate, or even the accomplishments we are proud of. It consists of the choices we make every day, choices to be true to ourselves, to our values, to our inner compass. I didn't know what the future would bring. A new job at the university, traveling with a European intellectual circle, perhaps even reconciliation with Elliot if he did change. But I knew one thing. No matter what happened, I would face that future not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who had finally found the freedom to be himself. And that, I thought, smiling at the stars, is perhaps the most valuable gift a person of my age can receive. Not the security of the familiar, but the freedom of the unknown. Not the comfort of stagnation, but the excitement of new possibilities. And if it took the betrayal of the people closest to me, well, maybe that was not too high a price to pay for true freedom.